So, we'll put this disclaimer out up front. I did use some AI. Who doesn't anymore, right? I didn't write any of this content with the AI, but it was really useful to me to have it ask me some questions. It was like, hey, what do you want to know? If you were given this talk synopsis and these thoughts that this person has, what else do you want to know? So I thought that was an interesting use of it. Some of the backgrounds and images I used were AI generated unless otherwise noted. You will have questions. You may not want to ask them. If you take this QR code, there's also an activity for you to rank some very popular games over the last few decades, and we'll show in the slide what everybody in the room thinks the best games out of the ones on the list. There's always more. I could have sat there for hours adding cool games. I'm like, oh yeah, that game. So please jump on there and put your questions in. I know sometimes people feel uncomfortable saying things in front of a large group, so this is your chance to ask a question, and you don't have to say a word unless you want to admit that it was you that asked the question. So, without further ado, here's our roadmap. A little bit of how I got there, how I accidentally became a game developer, and then some of the things that I learned, and I think anybody can learn doing game modding and building games. Believe it or not, the person sitting next to you is most likely a gamer of some sort. So whether you're playing Wordle on the New York Times app on occasion, or whether you're playing Candy Crush, or whether you're playing the newest Battlefield 6, 3.49 billion people are considered active gamers. I don't know what active means to the stats that I was reading, but they decided what that was, whether that was like somebody who played a game once a month or once a day, I don't know. But just for people who might not be familiar with it, what is a game mod? So that's something that I would consider anything that takes a game from what the original creator created and modifies it in some way. That can be as simple as, hey, I want this new item in the game, and I'm going to define that in a text file, and it's just the name of an item and what it does in a text file. That could be a mod. It could also be a full top-to-bottom rework. I saw one the other day that took the old Fallout 4 game and recreated the game entirely in the city of London. They hired voice actors. It's a massive, amazing undertaking that somehow uses the original game engine, but is such a departure from the game that you might not realize that it's almost an entirely different game. It could also be as simple as a modification to your screen that is a sticker that puts a crosshair back when the developer took it away. We'll talk more about that in a little while. So my journey looks a little bit like this. I don't know if that's worth reading. This is a rough approximation of a timeline of development. It starts all the way back here with some basic. Yay, basic. We had to talk about that earlier. Turbo Pascal, no one's ever heard of that one, but I happen to write some things in that. And then my first professional job was writing HTML. And you'll see along the bottom here are a bunch of games that I remembered from those eras of time. They're not necessarily favorites, but those are games I might have owned or played over the years. But I've always been both a gamer and a developer. And over the years, I also ran my own consulting business. So I started out doing PHP, HTML, all that sort of stuff. Today I work for a company doing real estate dashboards and sending emails and all sorts of fun things like that. I even worked for a Silicon Valley unicorn startup at one point in time. I don't know if that's a feather in your cap or a thing you're like, can't believe I did that. So along my career path, there was this little minor road bump called COVID. And I was working on a Laravel app at the time, I believe. And I was also finding outlets to make up for some things that were missing because of COVID. And so I ended up playing a role-playing game based off of Grand Theft Auto 5, which is now, what, a 12 or 14-year-old game, something like that. It is actually the second best-selling game in history, falling behind Minecraft by only 100 million or so sales. But it's had a really strong modding community, And as an older game, it's a lot more accessible to mod because people have figured out over the years all of the different things that are going on with it. And so I got into role-playing with people on that game, and you may have seen this content. It is the most popular content on Twitch to this day. Places like NoPixel are using the game engine that I was building on, and they'll get hundreds of thousands of views over the course of a month for that content. This is the most often the source of content that you see maybe on YouTube or things like that. I was working for an Australian company doing an Australian themed server, and so we're doing a lot of interesting things there. But I was just started out just role playing in that community, and then I realized, man, this interface is really interesting. Wonder how that works. And so I started digging into it, and it turns out the 5M engine for modding is actually just a Chrome browser overlaid with the game and plugged into all the APIs. So you can write code that runs in an overlay in a browser, and so you can make an HTML page that just plays into the game. So for example, you'll see some screenshots later, but if you want a speedometer, the base game of GTA does not include a speedometer. It's not that kind of game. But for our role-playing purposes, we have police officers who want to pull people over for speeding because that's an interesting interaction that people can have. Well, you got to give the players some idea that they're speeding first before you can tell them that they're, doing that. Well, we built that interface entirely in HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And then we're polling the game engine for the speed that the entity we're checking which entity you're in. Is it a car or some other kind of vehicle that we want to display a speedometer for? Okay, it is. Let's unhide that interface, and then let's ask the game engine how fast the entity is going, and then we had to do some conversion math because meters per second is not very useful for people to get a speed off of. So I spent some time learning that, which was really interesting. And I learned a lot through that process. We'll talk some more about the learning from that in a minute. And then more recently, I moved on from that for a variety of reasons. I've been working on a Project Zomboid mod. And so this is a little snapshot of that. And that's been a fun experience. And it's taken some of the Lua work that I was able to learn using 5M and allowed me to continue doing some of that. So now that we've established that I have spent way too much time playing games, allow me to attempt to justify that time that I probably would have spent anyway. So the tech stack is going to differ when you're doing game modding, but that's a good thing. So if you're interested in this, I view this as a tool to further your career in a variety of ways, similar to working on an open source project, just probably a little less stressful and a little bit more fun, hopefully. Learning a new language can be a really daunting task, especially without a framework or a path to go through. So giving yourself a challenge like, I want to make this game do something specific, can be a really good tool to learning and leveraging that as you move forward. This is what it looks like to mod a game. This is some of the raw source code from one of the scripts in Grand Theft Auto, and that is a mess. You may not be able to read it. It doesn't matter. None of it means anything. You've got things like local_240.f51. No one knows what that means. That's what the compiler decided that string was going to be, and no one actually cares about that string. But you might need to know where that string goes elsewhere in the code, or which other function is passing that reference in. There's a lot of puzzling things out when you're working with decompiled code. Some games are a lot more supportive of modders, and so they provide more stuff. There have been enough leaks of the GTA source at this point that most of those strings are very clear, and if you don't have an ethical or moral problem with it, you can go find the leak of the GTA source code and see what the function names were originally. I don't personally have a problem with that as long as I'm not using it to like build off of their work in a commercial sense. If I'm just using it to understand their work, the leak is out there, people are going to do what they do. I wouldn't use that for commercial purposes, but it's very interesting. As you can see, some of the modders over time have figured out at least what some of the strings mean. And so there's a variety of features in there. This function here is actually converting that string into a numerical sequence that the game uses to identify most of the objects in the game. It's really fascinating. That can also be really intimidating. And I think if it interests you, the other really cool thing about modding is the communities that typically form around it. So depending on the size of the game, it typically has a correlation to the size of the community. You'll find a lot of helpful people who've already figured out a lot of the weird stuff, and they've already decompiled the game because it was interesting to them and they have that particular tech skill set. And so I think you can find some interesting places to find a lot of help if you're trying to discover how to do something. How you engage with those communities is really important, but most of them are pretty welcoming. Going in there and just asking people, hey, I want to do the blah, blah, blah. They're like, this is another person who wants me to write the code for them. And we've all had that person in our lives at some point. Hopefully not too many of us have that on the daily. But if you come in with intelligent questions where you've tried to do the research beforehand and you're stuck, and you explain how you got to that point where you're stuck, you're going to get a lot of help. People are going to be very helpful when it comes to that type of interaction. Rarely do you have to be the guy who writes the decompiler, unless that's like your thing. So this is an example of the difference, one of the key learnings for me out of this was the performance difference between a web application and a game. So on the left here is an example of a menu system. That is all rendered in HTML. If you have really sharp eyes, you might notice those are font awesome icons, and that is an overlay in the Chrome browser, and when you mouse over this guy, he'll light up and give you these options in the game. Down here in the other corner, we have an example of some debugging code where I was writing a script to chop a car. Don't ask, it's a whole thing. And all of that is actually being rendered in the game engine, and I've told it that I want it to draw those things frame by frame. If I gave it those instructions from JavaScript, that would lag out so much with all the different displays that it's doing, because the JavaScript in this particular instance runs at about 100x slower than the Lua scripting. So JavaScript works great for this interface because it's working in a browser and it's not dependent on user interface. In this screenshot, all of those variables are pinned in 3D space, so as I move around the car, move the camera angle, all those variables are going to shift around because I want to know where the bonnet thing is in relation to the car that I'm messing with in code. And so I needed all those to be drawn in the world. It's way more complicated than you want to know about to draw things inside the web browser against the 3D relationship of the space around you. You can do it, but it's a pain in the butt. Where I can just tell the game engine I want text. I don't have any control over the fonts that are used for that, but if I want text in the world, that's one way I can do it. Wild difference in performance between the two different interfaces in terms of drawing things every frame. The Lua code is just way, way faster in that respect. One of the other performance things that I ran into is the game we were working on is essentially a live service game. And code that works great on your machine does not work so great sometimes when you throw 350 real-time players at it. And so there are some learnings that you have on N+1 problems and things like that, where scaling becomes an interesting thing that it's really hard to test for those things as well. So you just have to kind of learn the hard way what some of the instances are. Another thing that's really powerful about modding is that you get exposure to user feedback way more directly and way more real time than you might get in a lot of different organizations. So professional environments often put the user feedback far away from you. Maybe there's a whole separate team that's responsible for getting user feedback, or the ticket system is over in another place with some support people and you just never get any insight into it until it's an emergency and something's on fire, and then they send you the ticket and you're like, oh, okay, now I get it. It can be all sanitized and abstracted away. When you're working in a game modding environment, you're typically playing the game, right? So you're getting the feedback from your own use of it, and you're getting the opportunity to build on top of that, and hopefully you're getting some enjoyment from that as well. Don't mind me just modding myself back to life there. That's a thing you can do. So, getting to use your own product, that's something that I I work on a dashboard for real estate agents. I have no interest in doing their job. I don't want to figure out how to do their job in order to use the application like they use it. So I have to look for different ways to get feedback and learn how the users use it. And that's a little bit harder. Whereas if I'm playing a game, I'm playing the game and I get to actually do it. Another thing about user research is if you start plumbing the depths of this, you'll find there are a lot of really interesting things and ways you can explore how players interact with your game or your mod. And you can dive into the Bartle's player types all you want at some other point, but there's a lot of similar relationships when you start looking at users and how users are going to use your product. Some of them are going to be there for different purposes, and some of them are there to shoot people, right? That's different kinds of gamers. How your game appeals to them, whether it ignores them, those are all things that you can consider. But I think considering the user experience and how you have different types of users with different goals can be really informative to how you're building your applications. And doing it in the game modding space gives you an interesting place to learn and an interesting place to experiment with things that you might not be able to do in a corporate application or environment. Another major learning that I encountered over time was the malicious users. So not everybody out there has played online games, but if you have, you've probably run into a hacker or a modder at some point or another. There's always bad actors anytime there's a system like that. And so I typically found that I underestimated the amount of energy and time and motivation that people would put into breaking the things that I built. But overall, I would say there was 3 different categories of users that I saw over time. There was the casual abuser, the person who found that like if they spammed a certain key, they would get like multiples of a reward from a script, or the person who would accidentally disconnect and be given a free gun that they weren't supposed to get, and so then they would do it repeatedly until they got caught. And those casual people aren't really a problem because they usually share it with their friends and they usually get caught pretty quickly, and then you just reverse everything and ban them for a week and they come back all contrite and sad. The second person, the other person that sort of falls in the casual category, is the person who believes that everyone else is cheating, and so they've decided that it's okay to cheat too because they're just leveling the playing field. They're not a cheater, but because everybody else in their perception is cheating, they're going to cheat too just to level that playing field. The next player is the active cheater, the person who wants to win the game and believes that cheating is the right way to do that. They don't typically put a lot of energy into seeking out exploits. They're typically people who are going to be buying some cheat software somewhere, and so it's usually pretty easy to find them and detect them. But the third category of people in there are the malicious ones, and those are the ones that are the most damaging. They're the ones that I had the most trouble with, but they're also the easiest to predict what they're going to do. And there's some really easy things you can do, like handing out tokens and then validating your input instead of letting the user side just dictate all of your input, and firewalls and trust things. We just put phone number requirements on our Discord and then banned all the bad actors out of the Discord, and we got rid of like 95% of them that way. So there's all kinds of interesting things there. You may be asking this question, can modding get me a job? Maybe. Like a lot of you, I've signed more NDAs than I can probably count, which means that most of the code that I've written over my career is probably get me in a lot of trouble if I started talking about it in a public situation. I might be able to sneak it in here and there, but it's not really a great idea to go into a job interview and be like, yeah, I signed an NDA, but you want to look at the code that I wrote while I was there? No, I don't think they're going to hire you. The other side of that is that game mods are public typically. It'd be pretty weird for it to be private and hard to read. So that's code that you have written that you can show. For example, we can go back to the slide where I have 7,000 users on my mod in the Project Zomboid Steam workshop. Those are 7,000 people using something I wrote. So it clearly has some value to some people, and I can show that to a prospective employer. I can show them the code. It's all on GitHub if they want to see it. And so I can use that as a tool in an interview or job application process as a way to show off code and skills that I have without getting in trouble and crossing any lines. I find interviewers also find it really interesting. They ask a lot more questions when I show them examples from games than if I show them a boring to-do app that I made after following the free code camp stuff. The other thing about games is that a lot of this stuff is going to break down into systems that are familiar and different problems that you're going to face in a typical career, like we talked about with the user experience. Well, if you're studying how people are interacting with your game or mod, you're also going to be able to take that input on board from a corporate setting as well. I touched on this a brief moment ago about cheating and things like that. Ethics in modding is also something you need to be careful that you have the rights to use models and content. In the 5M community, there's a huge financial incentive to steal content and shove it into the game and then get people to pay you for that content. So people will take the Spider-Man model and they'll stick it into Grand Theft Auto and charge everybody $5 to put it into their game. And that's illegal because you didn't make the Spider-Man model if you ripped it from the other game, which is like if you own both copies of the game and you want to do that on your own thing, that's not an ethical problem. But selling it, that's a different problem. This is the kind of question that you might run into in a corporate situation as well, but it's typically driven by the motivations underneath it. And always make sure you're crediting your sources. The other thing I'll leave you with on the modding topic is how you measure success is really important. So if I'm just measuring like download numbers, I'm probably not going to be happy. And it's important for me to make sure that I'm having fun doing this. This should not be like another job for you unless you start making a lot of money. There are some people out there who make a lot of money. I was able to make a full-time living from the 5M server for a while, and there's certainly opportunities that exist in that space if that's something interesting to you to pursue. But making sure that you're metricing not just like user numbers, but also like, am I having fun doing this as a measure of what your success is there. I had a mod in the Steam, the Project Zomboid mod in the Steam workshop, had 4 out of 5 stars. And that really annoyed me because I had 149 positive thumbs up reviews and 1 negative. And I got 4 stars, and that made me mad. But I had to reevaluate and step back and be like, hey, look, I'm having fun doing this, and that one person out there might just be the kind of person who their existence in life is only to have fun by being mean to other people. Maybe that's them, I don't know. Hopefully they're having a better day. So calibrating your measure of success is really important. All right, this is the part where we see how much time I have left. 5 minutes? There's bonus content in here if you guys didn't put any questions in. This is the QR code for the Slido. All right, 29 people responded. 30 responses. Looks like Zelda wins out with Super Mario and then Grand Theft Auto. Awesome. I'm surprised. No, I'm not. I'm really old. GoldenEye was my favorite. I have so much nostalgia from playing that game. That was probably one of the first games I ever played that you could put 4 people on a console at the same time in a tiny little TV. All right. Oh, awesome. We had some questions. So, are there any games or publishers in particular who encourage mods? Some companies tolerate it and some support it. 100%. I would say the Project Zomboid developers don't like focus on the modding community like some developers might, but they definitely support it and they definitely make it easier, and they have a whole system where you can publish your mods to the Steam Workshop, and it's really easy to click to install a mod and it just kind of works. And that's really important for the success of that type of interaction. Whereas Grand Theft Auto is entirely third party until they bought the big modding company, and we can talk millions of dollars later. I don't know if there are any big publishers that really support modding as directly, but Skyrim? Yeah, Skyrim is a big modding community. I have a whole slide in here of all of the mods that I found and how much money they were making, because that was the bonus content. There's a lot of mods out there. There's a lot of things for that. Let's see. Yeah, and there are some developers that have realized that tapping into their community in that way, like, they only have so many developers in-house, and like that one feature that 30 people think is really cool to add to the game isn't something they have the development resources for. But somebody who's really passionate about it, like that could be you or me, has an interest in making it, and so they find a lot of value in exposing APIs and documentation for those kinds of things. Have I ever done modding for space engineers? No, I have not. I know it's quite popular amongst certain circles, and I have heard of it, but I've not played it. If you want a fun game to waste your time, it's open source. It's called Bitburner, and that is a fun game to write some JavaScript programming in. Sounds like the programming block that is in-game with space engineers. Bitburner's a hacker simulator. Have you done any game modding development? Not directly. Everything I've done so far has been building on the top of other platforms. I've definitely considered doing my own game, but I don't feel like I have the right story that just I've connected with that I want to build out in a game exclusively just yet. What is the most accessible? I assume like accessibility in terms of like mouse, keyboard, or visuals. I don't know. There's some really good ones out there. I don't need accessibility things. Or are we talking about like ease of programming? I don't know if the person who wrote that wants to speak up, but I'm going to assume it's probably ease of programming now that I read it again. We're going to get the question bumped off the screen. Off the top of my head, I don't know. Almost all of them you have to have some understanding of the code underneath the game and how it works. And that's not as big of a priority for a lot of the developers as actually making the game is. All right. Some modders use IP law, get around it. It's a deep question about IP law. We can have a conversation about that over on the other side. When I was adding content to 5M, we had modelers on our team that created all of the assets, or we purchased them from third parties. So, all right. I think Barry's giving me the high sign now.